Which theoretical perspective focuses on the influence of societal norms, cultural expectations, and social inequalities in shaping abnormal behavior? A. Sociocultural perspective. B. Humanistic perspective. C. Existential perspective. A. Sociocultural perspective. The sociocultural perspective emphasizes how cultural, social, and environmental factors contribute to the development of abnormal behavior. It considers factors such as family dynamics, cultural norms, socioeconomic status, and societal expectations as significant influences on psychological well-being. According to which theoretical perspective, abnormal behavior is viewed as a result of a lack of fulfillment of basic needs and the failure to reach one's full potential? A. Humanistic perspective. B. Cognitive behavioral perspective. C. Psychodynamic perspective. A. Humanistic perspective. The humanistic perspective, proposed by psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, suggests that abnormal behavior occurs when individuals experience a discrepancy between their actual selves and their ideal selves, leading to feelings of dissatisfaction and distress. Which theoretical perspective emphasizes the role of free will, personal responsibility, and the search for meaning in understanding abnormal behavior? A. Existential perspective. B. Biological perspective. C. Cognitive behavioral perspective. A. Existential perspective. The existential perspective focuses on the individual's freedom of choice, responsibility for their actions, and the quest for meaning and purpose in life. It suggests that abnormal behavior may arise from an individual's struggle with existential concerns such as: a person who believes that abnormal behavior stems from unresolved conflicts during childhood would likely subscribe to which theoretical perspective? A. Cognitive behavioral perspective. B. Biological perspective. C. Psychodynamic perspective. C. Psychodynamic perspective. The psychodynamic perspective, founded by Sigmund Freud, posits that abnormal behavior results from unconscious conflicts and unresolved issues from early childhood experiences. It emphasizes the role of unconscious processes, defense mechanisms, and the structure of the personality in shaping behavior. According to which theoretical perspective, abnormal behavior is viewed as a result of maladaptive thought patterns and behaviors that can be modified through therapy techniques. A. Humanistic perspective. B. Cognitive behavioral perspective. C. Sociocultural perspective. B. Cognitive behavioral perspective. The cognitive behavioral perspective focuses on how maladaptive thought patterns and behaviors contribute to abnormal behavior. It emphasizes the role of cognitive processes such as perception, interpretation, and memory, as well as observable behaviors. Therapeutic interventions in this perspective aim to modify dysfunctional thoughts and behaviors through techniques such as cognitive restructuring and behavior modification. Which theoretical perspective emphasizes the role of neurotransmitters, genetics, and brain abnormalities in explaining abnormal behavior? A. Biological perspective. B. Sociocultural perspective. C. Existential perspective. A. Biological perspective. The biological perspective attributes abnormal behavior to physiological factors such as genetics, neurotransmitter imbalances, hormonal abnormalities, and structural or functional abnormalities in the brain. It focuses on the biological basis of mental disorders and often involves interventions such as medication and neuroimaging techniques. According to the sociocultural perspective, which of the following factors is likely to influence the development of abnormal behavior? A. Genetic predisposition. B. Cultural norms. C. Brain chemistry. B. Cultural norms. The sociocultural perspective emphasizes the impact of cultural norms, societal expectations, and social inequalities on the development of abnormal behavior. Cultural norms dictate what is considered normal or abnormal behavior within a specific cultural context, influencing individuals' attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. In the humanistic perspective, abnormal behavior is often viewed as a result of: A. Unconscious conflicts. B. Failure to reach one's potential. C. Maladaptive thought patterns. B. Failure to reach one's potential. The humanistic perspective suggests that abnormal behavior occurs when individuals fail to fulfill their basic psychological needs and reach their full potential for personal growth and self-actualization. This discrepancy between one's actual self and ideal self can lead to feelings of dissatisfaction and distress. Sarah experiences intense fear and anxiety when she encounters small, enclosed spaces such as elevators or crowded rooms. Which theoretical perspective in abnormal psychology would focus on unresolved unconscious conflicts from childhood as the root cause of her phobia? A. Biological perspective. B. Psychodynamic perspective. C. Behavioral perspective. B. Psychodynamic perspective. Sarah experiences intense fear and anxiety in specific situations, which aligns with the symptoms of a phobia. The psychodynamic perspective in abnormal psychology emphasizes the role of unconscious conflicts and unresolved issues from childhood in the development of psychological disorders. Therefore, this perspective would focus on Sarah's unconscious conflicts as the root cause of her phobia. Jackson has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, experiencing delusions and hallucinations. Which theoretical perspective would emphasize the role of neurotransmitter imbalances and genetic predispositions in his condition? A. Cognitive perspective. B. Biological perspective. C. Humanistic perspective. B. Biological perspective. Schizophrenia is a complex disorder characterized by hallucinations, delusions, and disruptions in thought processes. The biological perspective in abnormal psychology emphasizes the role of biological factors such as genetics, neurotransmitter imbalances, and brain abnormalities in the development of mental disorders. Therefore, this perspective would highlight the role of neurotransmitter imbalances and genetic predispositions in Jackson's schizophrenia. Maria often engages in self-destructive behaviors like cutting herself when she feels overwhelmed by her emotions. Which theoretical perspective might suggest that her behavior is a learned response to cope with distressing situations? A. Behavioral perspective. B. Cognitive perspective. C. Humanistic perspective. A. Behavioral perspective. Maria engages in self-destructive behaviors as a way to cope with overwhelming emotions. The behavioral perspective in abnormal psychology focuses on how behaviors are learned and maintained through interactions with the environment. It suggests that maladaptive behaviors like self-harm may develop as a result of reinforcement or coping mechanisms. Therefore, this perspective would attribute Maria's behavior to being a learned response to cope with distressing situations. Alex has been diagnosed with major depressive disorder and often experiences negative thoughts about himself and his future. Which theoretical perspective would focus on the maladaptive thought patterns contributing to his depression? A. Psychodynamic perspective. B. Cognitive perspective. C. Sociocultural perspective. B. Cognitive perspective. Major depressive disorder is characterized by persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and negative thoughts. The cognitive perspective in abnormal psychology focuses on how maladaptive thought patterns and cognitive distortions contribute to the development and maintenance of mental disorders. Therefore, this perspective would emphasize the role of Alex's negative thought patterns in his depression. John has an intense fear of public speaking, which significantly impacts his academic and professional life. Which theoretical perspective would attribute his fear to a lack of positive regard and acceptance during his childhood? A. Humanistic perspective. B. Sociocultural perspective. C. Cognitive perspective. John has an intense fear of public speaking, which significantly impacts his academic and professional life. Which theoretical perspective would attribute his fear to a lack of positive regard and acceptance during his childhood? A. Humanistic perspective. B. Sociocultural perspective. C. Cognitive perspective.